A few weeks ago, I was playing hockey, and if you know anything about me, I love hockey. If you don't like hockey, this might not be the right church for you. There's a soccer church down the street. You can go check out that, but we love hockey here. And so in January, I had my friend who was a former NHL player. January 8th, John Blue came, and he preached a message here. And so after that, John invited me to go and play some pickup hockey with him and some of his friends. And so this particular pickup hockey group, the way it works is you get emailed and invited into it, and then the guy who organizes it, he sends out a roster. And if your name's on the roster, you get to play at that particular time, that ice time. And so some former NHL players play in this pickup time from time to time. And so I got on the roster, and it was my first time getting to play with my friend John Blue. And so the email came the night before, and I looked at the roster, and it said Keith Primeau. Now, my name is Ken Primeau, but the guy had written Keith Primeau on the roster. Now, that name might not mean much to any of you, but Keith Primeau was an NHL hockey player. In fact, I believe we have a picture of him. He was an all-star player. He's 6'5", 220 pounds ripped. At this moment, he was the captain of the Philadelphia Flyers. And so he's about 45 years old, retired professional hockey player. And so when people saw the name Keith Primeau on the roster, and there was other former NHL players there, they were expecting this guy to show up at the ice. And so you got to imagine that some of them were disappointed when instead of getting a pro hockey player, they got a pastor, 5'10", who stepped on the ice. And some of them on the bench kind of expressed their disappointment to me as they saw Primeau on the back and realized I was not Keith Primeau. In fact, there was a typo on the roster. But you see, they had the correct last name, they just didn't have the right first name. They had the correct last name, they just didn't have the right identity. They had the wrong person. And so because they saw the name Keith Primeau, they defined me, they labeled me before they even saw me or met me. They thought I was this great hockey player. And in fact, I was an amateur hockey player that stepped onto the ice, and they were disappointed. Well, my brother, he's got a better story because his name, in fact, is Keith Primeau. So my brother's name is Keith Primeau. He was also 5'10". Him and I, we played amateur hockey growing up, but we were never good enough to be, in the NHL. And so we've grown up playing hockey, and now our kids are getting into hockey. And my nephew, his name is Cody. Cody started playing a few years ago up in San Jose. And so on his team, I think he was 7 at the time, on his hockey team of other 7-year-olds, some of the other kids, their dads play for the San Jose Sharks. And so there was about 3 or 4 kids that their parents are professional hockey players. And so they got, the last name Marlowe, and their dads, Patrick Marlowe on the San Jose Sharks. And so all these different professional hockey players, their kids were on the team. And so the coach, one of the first practices, he saw Primeau. And so he said to my nephew, Cody, come over here. And so Cody came over and he said, Cody, is your dad's name Keith? And Cody looked up at him and said, yep. And the coach said, Cody, did your dad play hockey? And Cody, innocently as a 7-year-old, he's like, yeah, my dad grew up in Canada. He played hockey. Yep. And the coach said, Cody, your dad was one of the greatest hockey players that ever lived. Cody looked up to him and said, yep. My brother has never corrected him. My brother loves that story. He had the right name, but the wrong identity attached to it. He had the right name, but the wrong identity attached to who he was talking about. And you see, the same thing is with Jesus. You're like, where are you going with this? Jesus didn't play hockey. The same thing is with Jesus, because people might have known, the name Jesus, but they defined him, they labeled him differently. And different groups of people had a different idea of who Jesus was. They labeled him differently. They defined him differently. And so for some people, they thought he was a liar. Jesus was a false teacher. He's some maniac. He's teaching false things to the people. And a lot of the religious people of his day thought Jesus was teaching false things, and he was just some false teacher. Other people might have thought he's a good man. He's a good person. Does some really cool things. Teaches some cool things. And yet others, they thought, this is the Messiah. This is the chosen one. There's something about this guy that's so different and so unique. And so people had different labels. People had different ideas about who Jesus was. And it's the same thing with us today. We define Jesus differently. We have different ideas about who Jesus is. Some people would say he was a great teacher. Some would say he's a prophet. Some would say he was a fictional character. Others would define him as their Savior, their Lord. See, we all have different views of who Jesus is, different identities of who he is. We might say the same name, Jesus, but we might be talking about very different people, definitions of who Jesus is. And so I want you to imagine, this probably wouldn't happen, but imagine you're in an elevator with a stranger, and the stranger asked you, you got 30 seconds, you're going up an elevator, the stranger asked you, who do you say Jesus is? How would you define him? Just think about it. What would you say to that person? You got 30 seconds to tell them, this is who Jesus is. What would you say? How would you define Jesus? And that's what we're going to talk about together this morning, is not only how do you define Jesus, but here's the big question, and you can write this down if you're taking notes, is why does our definition of Jesus matter? Why does it matter your 30-second answer in the elevator? Why does it even matter? Why does it make a difference? Why should any of us care how you define Jesus, what you think about him and his identity? And so what we're going to see today is why our definition of Jesus actually matters, how you define him, how that makes a difference. And to do so, I want to invite you to grab a Bible, and we're going to look together through the Gospel of Matthew and what Matthew teaches us about who Jesus is. And so if you pull out a Bible with us, turn to Matthew chapter 5. It's on page 677 in the blue Bibles under your seat. If you didn't bring a Bible with you, grab one of those. If you don't own a Bible, that is our gift to you. Please take that Bible home with you today. But turn in a Bible, you can use your Bible app, Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to look at a few passages in the book of Matthew. So we're going to stay in the book of Matthew today. And the first thing that we see is that, if you're taking notes, you can write this down, that Jesus is an extraordinary teacher. Jesus is an extraordinary teacher. The way he taught, the things that he taught were so dynamic and so different. You see, at the time when Jesus was a teacher, the other Jewish rabbis, the other religious teachers of the day, the religious people, they would show up. If you were, an active churchgoer, they would show up at the synagogue or the temple on Saturdays. And the rabbi would teach, and he would open up to the book of the law, the first 5 books of our Bible, and he might begin to imagine that you were an active churchgoer at the time. The pastor would get up and would kind of read a dry reading from the book of Leviticus. Okay, and from Leviticus, I would begin to tell you what you can and can't wear. Okay, no wool and linen at the same time. Come on, people, we're religious here. No wool and linen at the same time. And so, what you can and can't wear. The pastor would then start to talk about what you can and can't eat. No pork for you. No bacon this morning. Okay, and then the pastor began to talk about what kind of haircut you can have. Okay, no mullets. All right, that's against the law. No mullets in our congregation. And so it was dry. It was that type of teaching. And then Jesus comes along, and his teaching is so radically different. He begins to tell stories. He begins to teach through something called parables, and he begins to teach this truth that's so dynamic and so different. And the people begin to wonder, who is this man? This guy's no ordinary teacher. This guy's extraordinary. And he begins to teach so differently. I want you to look with me in Matthew 5, beginning in verse 3. We call this the Sermon on the Mount. This is the only recorded, full sermon that we have of Jesus. We have other teachings. Anything red letter, and some of your Bibles have red letter. This is the only recorded sermon we have of Jesus. And it's Matthew chapter 5 through 7. Matthew chapter 5 through 7, we call it the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus begins to teach, and his teaching's so dynamic and so different. We begin in verse 3, chapter 5. Jesus said, "Blessed are the rich." Oh no, it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Verse 4, "Blessed are those who are joyful." Oh no, it says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Verse 5, "Blessed are the strong." Oh, it says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Verse 6, "Blessed are those who are full." Oh, it says, "Blessed are those who are hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Have you ever met or heard someone use a word And by the way they were using it, the context they were using it in, you were like, I don't think you know what that word means. You ever had that? Like someone's using a word and you're like, I don't really think you get what that word actually means. It's kind of like this, when parents are trying to text message and use like the short like hip code for stuff and they use it wrong. We have an example, I believe, right here. So this is a mom texting her son and she said, your great aunt just passed away, LOL. And the son said, why is that funny? It's not funny, David. What do you mean? Mom, LOL means laughing out loud. She said, oh my goodness, I sent that to everyone. I thought it meant lots of love. I have to call everyone back. In the same way, it's like, Jesus, I don't think you know what blessed means, okay? I think you're using this out of context. And maybe you don't understand what this word means. What are you talking about, blessed are the poor in spirit? No, blessed are the rich. Blessed are those who mourn? No. Blessed are those who are joyful. Jesus, what are you talking about? And yet Jesus, he knew exactly what he meant. Jesus' teaching was so dynamic and so different and so kind of in your face of, wow, look at this truth. And what he was saying is the kingdom of God is so dynamically different than everything else you've experienced in your life. It turns everything upside down. And so they realized Jesus' teaching is so unique and so different. And throughout the Sermon on the Mount, we just see over and over again that Jesus' teaching is so powerful and so unique and so dynamic and so extraordinary. Everything he has to say about murder, adultery, divorce, all these things. Jesus raised the bar on all of his teachings. And what we see is, I want you to turn with me to the end of this sermon, the response of the people. Chapter 7, verse 28. Chapter 7, verse 28. So Jesus has finished this Sermon on the Mount. And then it says these words in chapter 7, verse 28. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were what? They were amazed at his teaching. Because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. They recognized his teaching is so dynamically different than all the other teachers. And their response was one of amazement. The crowds were amazed by Jesus. They realized he was an extraordinary teacher. But the crowds, although they realized Jesus is an extraordinary teacher, the verb that's used there is a passive verb, which means that they hadn't committed to actually following him. They hadn't yet committed to following his teaching. They were amazed and said, wow, this guy is a great teacher, but they hadn't committed to being his disciple, to being a follower of him. And you see, you and I, we could go, wow, Jesus is a great teacher. I really like a lot of what he has to say. Maybe not all of it, but I like a lot of what he has to say. And if we see Jesus simply as a great teacher, which he was an extraordinary teacher, but if that's the extent of it, if we don't see more than that, then you and I, we can treat Jesus like a buffet. I haven't been to a buffet in a while, but maybe you've experienced a buffet, and what you get to do is you go and you pick what you want to eat. And so you kind of walk through and look, you get your plate and your tray out, and I'll have a little bit of that, I'll have a little bit of this, I'll have a little bit of that, and you kind of pick and you leave the things that you don't want and you grab the things that you do want. In fact, at a buffet, you can grab stuff that you think you want, and then you get to your table and you, I actually don't even want this, and you just leave it there, right? And we can treat Jesus' teaching the same way. I'll have a little bit of this, I'll have a little bit, I don't like that, I'm not gonna do that, I'm gonna have a little bit of this. And you can even bring it and sit with it for a while and go, actually, I don't even want some of that. And we can pick and choose. We can treat Jesus like a buffet. If Jesus is just an extraordinary teacher, and he's not more than that, and he's not Lord of your life, then we can just pick and choose. We can go, oh, I love listening to sermons, or I love reading the Bible. But we don't have to commit to obeying if Jesus is just a teacher, and he's not more than that in our lives. You see, Jesus is an extraordinary teacher, but he's more than that. The second thing we see is this. Matthew continues to show us and reveal to us that Jesus is an extraordinary miracle worker. Jesus is an extraordinary miracle worker. He does not only says some dynamic and amazing things that amaze the crowds, but he also does things that people go, that was amazing. That was extraordinary. That was so dynamic. And what we see is that the disciples and the crowds, they see that Jesus begins to do some miraculous things. And if you read chapter 24 of the story this week, you'll see that there's a bunch of amazing teachings that Jesus did, but then there's some dynamic things that he did. For example, we see in the next chapter, in chapter 8, that he heals a man of leprosy. Someone's got a skin disease and Jesus heals them. And then there's a Roman centurion, this Roman soldier, who has a servant who's sick. And Jesus heals the servant without even touching them, seeing them, being in the same place as them. He just snaps his finger and the person's healed. The people begin to realize this is an extraordinary miracle worker. Jesus is able not only to teach extraordinary things, but Jesus actually does some miraculous things as well. And I want us to see one of those things in chapter 8, verse 23. In chapter 8, verse 23, if you look there with me, it says this, "Then Jesus got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake." And this is the Sea of Galilee on this lake. So this big storm comes so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. Jesus is just taking a nap. His disciples are kind of getting panicky as the water's coming over the edge of this boat. And the disciples went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." Jesus replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up, rebuked the wind and the waves, and it was completely calm. The storm just dissipates. And see their response. Verse 27. The men were what? Amazed, just like the crowds. The men were amazed. The disciples were amazed. And they ask a question. What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. What kind of man is this? The disciples yet, they haven't discovered fully who Jesus is. They know he's this extraordinary teacher. And now they're seeing him do miracles, and they're on this boat, and they're afraid, and they wake Jesus up, and Jesus completely calms the wind and the waves. And they go, who is this guy? What kind of man is this? This is no ordinary man. That even the wind and the waves obey him. And they begin to realize that Jesus is this extraordinary miracle worker. We have to see that he's more than that. Because if you and I, if we see Jesus as a miracle worker, nothing more than that, then we can treat Jesus like a genie. Right? Jesus is this genie. You rub the magic lamp and you get 3 wishes. Or we could treat Jesus like a vending machine, like pop in a few prayers, press the right buttons, and then out you get what you want from him. And so we can just, God, Jesus, can you hook it up? When we pray like, Jesus, can you do this for me? Could you heal this person, my grandma? Jesus, could you get this job for me that I really want? Or can you get me into the school that I really want? Can you get me the stuff that I want? Jesus, can you get me a date with that girl? Not that one? Okay, I can't get that one. How about that girl, Anyone. And so we start to treat Jesus like a genie or like a vending machine. And if Jesus is just a miracle worker for us, then we can become more consumed with what he does for us rather than who he truly is. What we can get from him, the miracles he can do, the stuff he can do for us, rather than being consumed with who he truly is, his identity. See, Jesus was a miracle worker, but he's more than that. And Matthew continues to show that Jesus is not only this extraordinary teacher, because if he's just an extraordinary teacher, then you and I, we can treat him like a buffet and just pick and choose the things that we like. But he's got to be more than that. And if he's just an extraordinary miracle worker, then we can treat him like a genie or like a vending machine and just try to get things from him. But Matthew's wanting to show us, and Jesus was revealing more and more of who he was, of his identity. And he's helping the disciples to see who he is. And he invites us through the book of Matthew on this journey to discover more and more of who Jesus is. And we begin to see this truth, and you can write this down, that Jesus is the Son of God who is worthy of our worship. I'll give you a lot to write down there. Jesus is the Son of God who is worthy of our worship. Leave it up there for a second so that I can get all that down. Jesus is revealing his identity of who he is. That he is the Son of God. And the rightful response to who he is worship. When we turn together, there's another time where the disciples were in a boat with Jesus. Turn to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. It's the last verse I'm going to make you move to. Matthew 14, verse 22. And the disciples are once again on a boat, and there's a storm. Now, prior to this, all 4 of the Gospels, so if you don't know, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are 4 accounts of Jesus' birth, his life, his death. It tells the story of Jesus from 4 different people's accounts. And so this is the account from Matthew. And all 4 of the Gospels tell us that prior to this, that Jesus had distributed and fed 5,000 men, plus women and children. So 5,000 men were fed off of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So Jesus had just done this miracle. And then we read that Jesus sends his disciples off into a boat, once again on that same lake. So that's where we come to Matthew 14, verse 22. And it says this: immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat right after they had done this feeding of the 5,000. He sent them off in a boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Verse 23, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Do we have any introverts here? Introverts like me? Awesome. Okay, Jesus was an introvert. He had to get off on his own alone time away from the disciples. And so he's off praying. And later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. There was a storm. The waves were crashing against this boat. And so it's taken them a long time to get across the lake. Verse 25, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Okay, before we go further, I just want you to put yourself in the boat. Okay, you've been following Jesus around. He's been teaching some dynamic things. He's been doing some pretty cool miracles. Okay, but then you see this. You're out in a boat. The waves are crashing against you. And in the midst of that storm, you see someone walking on water. Okay, now if you've read the story a bunch of times, maybe you've kind of like, oh yeah, whatever. Think about that. You're in the boat. The person who's been, you don't even actually, at this point, they don't even know who it is. But someone's walking on top of water. How would you respond? Well, here's what the disciples do. They saw Jesus walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Verse 26 says, they said, it's a ghost. Seems natural to believe that. You know, you're out on a boat and someone's walking on water. It's a ghost, they cried. They said and cried out in fear. Verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Now, Jesus didn't say, take courage, it's Jesus. He said, take courage, it is I. Now, Jesus isn't just doing bad grammar. It's not like Jesus speak gooder English here. It is I. What are you talking about? Jesus was intentionally using words, Old Testament language, that God used when he spoke of himself. We use, you might have heard the word Yahweh. This is the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh. And what it means is I am. I am. And in the Old Testament, when Moses was going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, and he's going before Pharaoh, he says, what should I tell the people who sent me? And God says to him, tell them I am sent you. And so Jesus doesn't say, hey, have no fear, everything's fine. Jesus is here. Jesus says, not it is Jesus, he says, it is God. It is I. He's revealing to the disciples more of who he is, his identity. And he tells them, don't be afraid, because God's here. I am God. In verse 28, Peter responds, and he says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. So Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind and he was afraid, began to sink and cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand, caught him, said, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down once again. Then verse 33, we see their response. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Truly you are the Son of God. They began to discover more of the truth of who his identity was. And their response was to fall down and worship before him. Truly you are the Son of God. It's the first time they said that statement. Jesus has revealed himself to them. It is I am God who is walking to you in the midst of this storm. And as they see a fuller picture of who Jesus is, they respond in worship to him. And I love how Max Lucado, he was imagining what it would have been like to be one of the disciples, and then the next day writing in your journal. Now, I don't think that the disciples would have, journaled a whole lot, but imagine that they had a journal or a diary, and they were writing the next day about this experience. This is what they might have said. So this, I had never seen Jesus as I saw him then. I had seen him as powerful, like a miracle worker. I had seen him as wise and extraordinary teacher. I had witnessed his authority and marveled at his abilities. But what I witnessed last night, I know I'll never forget. I saw God. The God who can't sit still when the storm is too strong. The God who lets me get frightened enough to need him, and then comes close enough for me to see him. The God who uses my storms as his path to come to me. I saw God. It took a storm for me to see him, but I saw him, and I'll never be the same. You see, Jesus is inviting each and every one of us on a deeper journey to see more of who he is, his identity. And Jesus wants you to know him as Son of God, that he is God who came down to us so that we could be with him. And as we see a bigger picture, more of a vision of who Jesus truly is, the proper response is a life of worship. Now, worship isn't just singing songs, and the worship team here does a fabulous job of leading us in singing worship to God through song. But worship is really about whole life worship. Romans 12 tells us that in view of God's mercy, for us to live our lives as a sacrifice of worship. Our entire lives are supposed to be worship to God. And that's the proper response to who Jesus is, to who God is. And so this leads us to our big idea this morning. If you want to write this down, is this. Why does it matter our definition of Jesus? It matters because how you define Jesus helps determine how you'll worship him. How you define Jesus helps determine how you will worship him. First of all, whether you're going to worship him or not. But then if you do worship him, it'll impact the nature of your worship of him. Let me just say this. None of us has a perfect view of God. None of us have a perfect view of Jesus. We all have partially good views of Jesus. But none of us has a perfect view of Jesus. You see, for many of us, our view of Jesus might be impacted by culture. Many of us, it's impacted by the church culture we've grown up in or a church tradition. And often we emphasize one aspect of who Jesus is over another. And so for some, it's like this picture of Jesus it's all about truth and a really heavy emphasis on Jesus as a teacher and all about, listening to the word and listening to sermons, and it's all about the word. Jesus is a teacher and truth. And we emphasize that, and maybe that was kind of what you grew up with, at the expense of other aspects of who Jesus is. And for others, it's like, no, Jesus is your friend. Jesus is a friend of sinners. Jesus is just so nice and just so loving. And we emphasize that at the expense of the fact that Jesus is holy and he is God. And he's speaking really difficult truth into our lives. See, we like to emphasize certain aspects of who Jesus is. But Jesus wants to reveal himself more fully to each and every one of us. So that our worship, our life worship, will be more fully true to him. You see, how you define Jesus helps determine how you will worship him. Now, maybe you're here and you're like, my life doesn't worship him at all. And the first step for you is deciding that I want to surrender my life to him. Just as we sang, I surrender all. I surrender my life to Jesus, to following him, to letting him be the teacher in my life and submitting not just to the parts I like, but to all of what he has to say. All of the demands he makes on my life. And to trusting his power and his extraordinary miracle working in and through your life. But the starting place is saying, I surrender. I want to follow. I want to let him lead. And I want to live a life of worship for him. And for others, you've made that commitment. But not every nook and cranny of your life is worshiping God. Not every nook and cranny of your life is lived out as expression of worship to Jesus. And Jesus is God, the Son of God. Jesus deserves our whole life to be worshiped to him. But maybe there's aspects of your life, aspects of your relationship with him where you don't view him fully correctly. Maybe you're emphasizing one attribute of who he is at the expense of another. and it's leaking out in your life in areas that you're not worshiping him. You see, I think a lot of times we think, well, part of my life isn't worshiping him. I've got this area that's not really glorifying to God, but this other area is. And I think a lot of times we think, okay, let me just figure out what's wrong with me. And rather than looking up and saying, maybe I have my view of God, my view of Jesus is partially correct. It's not fully there. And for us to look at him and go, I want to see that you're a bigger vision of who you are. I want to trust you more fully with my life. And God, would you make my entire life about worship for you? You see, the disciples, as they journeyed, and Matthew records this for us to see, as they journeyed along with Jesus, more and more Jesus revealed himself to them. And they discovered more and more the truth, a bigger vision of who he was. That he wasn't just a teacher, that he wasn't just some extraordinary miracle worker, but that he was the Son of God, that he was God, that he was their Savior, that he was their Messiah, that he was their Lord, that he was their friend, that he loved them. And he wanted to walk with them and lead them and guide them. And as they discovered more and more and saw a bigger picture, of better vision of who Jesus truly was, they fell down in worship before him. They responded in worship to him. And then they lived their lives following him for the rest of their lives and learning to live lives of worship. And now may we be a church. May we be a church of people who would recognize that how we define Jesus helps determine how we will worship him. And may we gain a better vision, a bigger vision of who Jesus truly is. And may we respond with lives of worship and praise to him.